What if I told you the most powerful technology ever invented wasn't the wheel, the printing press, or even the internet, but something far older and more primal? Picture this: 40,000 years ago, in the flickering torchlight of a cave, a human hand pressed against stone, leaving behind not just pigment but meaning. That moment, the birth of storytelling, wasn't just art. It was the spark that would ignite civilizations, topple kings, and weave the invisible threads that bind us even today. Because storytelling isn't just about tales around a fire, it's humanity's first operating system, a technology of control and resistance so potent, it shaped every empire, every revolution, every whisper of shared identity across millennia. Think about the last story that moved you, maybe a film that left you breathless or a childhood myth that still lingers in your bones. Now imagine that power multiplied across centuries, harnessed to command armies, justify laws, or unite the oppressed. From the Epic of Gilgamesh etching the first hero's journey into clay, to slaves weaving freedom songs under the cover of night, stories have always been dual-edged tools. They can crown rulers like pharaohs claiming divine right through sacred texts, or dismantle them like pamphlets fueling revolutions. And here's the chilling truth: whoever controls the narrative controls reality itself. So how did something as simple as a story become the ultimate social technology? That's the mystery we're unraveling today. We'll trace how cave paintings evolved into propaganda, how grandmothers' folktales secretly preserved resistance, and why even today the stories we believe about history, justice, or even ourselves hold invisible power over our lives. This isn't just about the past, it's about the hidden strings tugging at our world right now. Because once you see storytelling for what it truly is, a lever to move minds, to build or break empires, you'll never listen to a story the same way again. Ready to decode the oldest technology running our collective imagination? Let's begin. Long before the first cities rose or laws were written, humans carried something far more powerful in their mind: stories. Picture a hunter crouched by a fire 30,000 years ago, gesturing wildly as he recounts how the great mammoth fell. Was he just entertaining his tribe? Or was he doing something far more profound, turning raw experience into shared memory, danger into wisdom, chaos into order? This primal instinct to narrate didn't just explain the world. It rewired it. Take the stars, for example. Ancient cultures didn't just see random dots of light, they saw Orion the hunter, the Great Bear, the serpent coiled across the heavens. These weren't mere fantasies, they were survival tools, turning the overwhelming unknown into a map anyone could follow. But stories did something even more revolutionary. They forged the first social contracts. When elders told of the ancestor who broke tribal taboos and brought famine, they weren't just spinning yarns, they were encoding laws before laws existed. And here's where storytelling's dark genius emerges. The same tale that taught children which berries were poisonous could also whisper, "Our chieftain speaks with the thunder god's voice." Early hierarchies didn't rely on swords or gold to maintain power. They relied on myths, sacred stories that made authority feel inevitable, divine. Yet for every tale propping up kings, there was another simmering beneath the surface. Enslaved Africans sang of flying back to ancestral lands, their spirituals hiding maps to freedom. Oppressed peasants passed down trickster folktales where the weak outsmarted the strong. This duality, stories as both cage and key, is written into our bones. The moment humans could say, "Once upon a time," we gained the power to define what time itself meant. Whether painted on cave walls or whispered in slave quarters, narratives became the invisible architecture of human society. They didn't just describe reality, they built it, one story at a time. Consider this: when early humans gathered around fires under star-filled skies, they weren't just sharing stories, they were stitching together the fabric of society itself. A single tale about a great flood or a cunning ancestor didn't just entertain, it told the tribe who they were, what they feared, and what bound them together. These shared narratives became the earliest social contracts, stronger than any law. The Epic of Gilgamesh wasn't just literature, it was Mesopotamia's moral compass, teaching lessons about friendship, mortality, and the duties of kings. But here's the twist: storytelling didn't just unite, it divided. Every culture's founding myth, from Rome's tale of Romulus and Remus to the Dreamtime stories of indigenous Australians, drew a line between us and them. The same stories that gave people identity could also justify conquest or exclusion. Take the Norse sagas, full of heroic exploits, yes, but also reinforcing codes of honor that demanded vengeance, shaping entire generations' sense of justice. And then there were the gatekeepers, shamans, bards, priests. They held the sacred duty of retelling the tribe's most important stories, but with that power came influence. A slight twist in the tale, an added warning about disobeying the chieftain, and suddenly the story wasn't just history, it was propaganda. The pharaohs of Egypt didn't just build pyramids, they etched their divine right into temple walls, ensuring every citizen knew their place in the cosmic order. Yet for every story used to control, another simmered in the shadows. Folktales became the underdog's weapon. Biara Rabbit outsmarting the fox wasn't just children's entertainment, it was enslaved Africans coding lessons of resistance into seemingly harmless fables. The trickster archetype, found everywhere from West Africa's Anansi to indigenous coyote tales, secretly celebrated defiance, teaching the oppressed how to outwit the powerful. This duality lives on today. National anthems, history textbooks, even corporate origin stories, they all follow the same ancient blueprint. The stories we repeat aren't just about the past, they shape what we believe is possible for the future. Because when you control the narrative, you don't just describe the world, you design it. Imagine a world where lightning wasn't just weather, it was Zeus hurling his wrath from the heavens, where floods weren't natural disasters but punishments from angry gods. Ancient civilizations didn't just create myths to explain storms or eclipses, they wove divine narratives so powerful, they dictated how societies lived, loved, and even obeyed. Take the Code of Hammurabi, one of history's earliest legal systems. It wasn't just a list of rules carved in stone, it was handed down by the god Shamash himself, turning earthly laws into divine commandments. Disobeying the king wasn't just rebellion, it was blasphemy. But here's the fascinating paradox: the same myths that cemented power could also unravel it. In Egypt, pharaohs ruled as living gods, their authority etched into temple walls and sacred texts. Yet when Akhenaten dared to replace the pantheon with a single sun god, he didn't just change religion, he shattered the storytelling framework holding Egyptian society together. His revolution failed not because of armies, but because the people clung to the older, deeper stories they knew. Meanwhile, in Greece, the myth of Prometheus, the titan who stole fire from the gods, became a rallying cry for defiance. To rulers, it was a warning about hubris. To the oppressed, it was a symbol of resistance, proof that even the divine order could be challenged. And this tension played out everywhere. Hindu epics like the Mahabharata taught duty and sacrifice, but also whispered questions about fate and free will. Norse sagas celebrated loyalty to kings until they didn't, with tales like Loki's tricks exposing the hypocrisy of the powerful. The brilliance of mythology lay in its fluidity. A story about a god's wrath could keep farmers paying temple taxes, or, in the hands of a dissenter, justify tearing those temples down. When Roman emperors claimed descent from Venus, they weren't just boasting, they were scripting their legitimacy into the cosmic narrative. But when early Christians recast those same pagan myths as falsehoods, they weren't just debating theology, they were rewriting the very foundation of imperial control. This dance between myth and power never really ended. Today's sacred narratives might wear different masks: national legends, ideological origin stories, even corporate myths about visionary founders. But the mechanism remains unchanged. Whoever controls the storytelling controls what people believe is possible, inevitable, or just. The gods may have faded, but their stories still shape us, proving that mythology was never about the divine. It was always about who gets to define what's divine. Before the first word was ever carved into stone, power belonged to those who could hold an entire history in their breath. Picture a firelit circle where elders spoke of ancestral deeds, their voices bending time itself with every syllable. These weren't just stories, they were living laws, genealogies, and moral codes, passed mouth to ear across generations. The griots of West Africa didn't merely recite kings' lineages, they curated them, deciding which triumphs to amplify and which failures to let fade into silence. A single omitted verse could erase a ruler's disgrace, while a whispered addition might sanctify rebellion. This was memory as both weapon and wound. Without written records, every retelling was an act of creation and manipulation. Celtic bards could praise a chieftain in one village, only to satirize him in the next, their rhymes shifting loyalties like wind-bending grass. Scandinavian skalds wielded kenning's poetic riddles that could veil insults in honeyed verses, leaving rulers powerless to protest without admitting the barb struck true. And when Hawaiian chanters preserved the Cumulipo, a creation epic thousands of lines long, they weren't just preserving myth, they were safeguarding the spiritual blueprint of their people's sovereignty against colonial erasure. But oral tradition's fragility made it revolutionary. Enslaved Africans turned work songs into maps, embedding directions to freedom in lyrics overseers dismissed as nonsense. Appalachian ballad keepers smuggled subversion into folk tunes, their verses lamenting mine owners' cruelty under the guise of old tragedies. Even children's rhymes became resistance tools, like the medieval Ring Around the Rosy, now widely thought to encode trauma from the Black Plague. The real magic lay in storytelling's deniability. A written decree could be burned, a whispered parable. It lived in the air, mutable as smoke. When Australian Aboriginal elders sang their Dreamtime stories into the ears of initiates, they weren't just teaching, they were encrypting. Land rights, survival knowledge, even satire of invading settlers hid in plain sound, undetectable to outsiders. Today, we still fight battles of collective memory. Politicians invoke nostalgic slogans to rewrite history. Marginalized communities reclaim erased narratives through oral histories. Every time we argue over how it really happened, we're replaying that ancient struggle, proving that memory was never just about the past. It's the first draft of the future. The moment humans pressed stylus into clay, something extraordinary happened. Stories broke free from breath and memory, becoming tangible, unchangeable, and dangerously permanent. Picture the first wedge-shaped marks pressed into Mesopotamian tablets 4,000 years ago. What began as simple accounting, how many sheep traded, how much grain stored, soon became something far more powerful, the written word as a weapon of control. Kings like Hammurabi didn't just carve laws into stone for clarity, they etched them into reality itself. Once a decree was written, it wasn't just spoken, it was ordained. The oral storyteller's tale might shift with each telling, but ink and stone turned fluid myths into rigid truth, and with that permanence came authority. Priests in Egypt didn't just recite hymns to the gods, they inscribed them on temple walls, turning rituals into unassailable doctrine. The Vedas, once passed down through generations of memorizing chanters, became sacred texts in India, their words frozen in script, resistant to reinterpretation. Writing didn't just preserve stories, it fossilized them, giving rulers and clergy an unprecedented tool, the power to say, "This has always been so." Yet for every empire wielding scrolls like scepters, rebels turned the same technology against them. When Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to a church door, he wasn't just protesting, he was exploiting the written word's viral potential. Pamphlets smuggled through 16th century Europe spread Reformation ideas faster than any sermon. Enslaved people like Frederick Douglass wielded autobiographies as proof of their humanity in a world that denied it. Even samurai in feudal Japan circulated handwritten broadsides mocking corrupt officials, their satires inked on fragile paper but striking like swords. The irony of writing meant to solidify control became the ultimate tool of dissent. A single subversive text, like Thomas Paine's Common Sense, could circulate in secret, its ideas spreading like wildfire in a way oral stories never could. Governments burned books to suppress revolutions, but the genie was out of the bottle. The written word didn't end the battle over narratives. It turned storytelling into a war of attrition, where ideas could lie dormant for centuries before igniting change. And so, the clay tablets of accountants evolved into the printing presses of revolutionaries. What began as a tool for counting sheep became the weapon that would topple kings. Because once stories could outlive their tellers, they became immortal, waiting like seeds in stone for the right moment to crack the world open. Consider the power of a single book, not just read, but revered as the literal word of the divine. Sacred texts like the Bible, the Quran, or the Vedas weren't merely collections of stories or laws. They were the world's first mass-produced blueprints for reality, shaping everything from how kings ruled to how peasants planted their fields. When Moses descended Mount Sinai with commandments etched in stone, he wasn't just delivering rules, he was installing an entire operating system for society, one where morality, justice, and even daily routines flowed from a single, unchallengeable narrative. But here's what makes religious storytelling uniquely potent: its dual nature as both unshakable truth and endlessly malleable metaphor. Take the parable of the Good Samaritan. On the surface, it's a simple moral lesson about kindness. Yet in 1st century Judea, where Samaritans were despised, it was a radical act of narrative warfare, dismantling prejudice with a story so subversive, it forced listeners to see their enemies as heroes. The same text that crowned emperors as gods chosen, like the doctrine of the divine right of kings, could also birth revolutions, as Protestant reformers proved when they wielded scripture to defy the Vatican. The Quran's revelation to Muhammad didn't just create a religion, it unified warring tribes under a shared linguistic and legal code, turning poetry into governance. Every verse memorized by millions wasn't just worship, it was collective programming, ensuring that from Marrakesh to Jakarta, the faithful navigated life by the same narrative compass. Yet even these supposedly immutable texts sparked schisms, Sunni and Shia Muslims diverging over succession stories, or Christians fracturing over translations of a single Greek word. And that's the paradox of sacred storytelling. The more eternal a text claims to be, the more fiercely humans fight to reinterpret it. Medieval monks illuminating Bibles added artistic flourishes that quietly shifted meanings. Kabbalistic scholars in Safe turned Torah study into a form of mystical code breaking, seeking hidden layers beneath the ink. Even the printing press, which mass-produced Luther's 95 Theses, didn't just spread ideas, it democratized the right to challenge holy narratives, proving no story stays sacred forever. What emerges isn't just a history of faith, but a pattern repeating through every era. Whether carved on temple walls or trending on social media, the stories we call sacred don't just describe power, they distribute it. The real miracle isn't that these texts survived centuries, it's that they remain battlegrounds, proving once again whoever controls the story doesn't just shape what we believe. They shape what we're willing to die for. Fairy tales might dress themselves in whimsy, talking animals, enchanted forests, wishes granted by fish, but beneath the velvet lies iron. Take the classic warning encoded in Little Red Riding Hood. On the surface, it's a simple cautionary tale: stray from the path and the wolf gets you. But peel back the layers and it's a masterclass in social control. That crimson hood wasn't just fashion, it was a beacon of puberty, the wolf a metaphor for predatory men, and the woods a dangerous world where girls who wandered faced ruin. The Brothers Grimm didn't invent these stories, they sanitized them, turning raw village folklore into primers on piety and obedience. Yet for every tale hammering home submission, a shadow version pulsed with rebellion. Before Perrault's Cinderella became a lesson in passive virtue, older renditions featured a heroine who tricked her stepsisters into cutting off their own toes. The original Sleeping Beauty didn't wake to a chaste kiss. She was raped by a passing king, then bore twins in her enchanted sleep. These weren't just darker stories, they were truth-tellers exposing the brutal realities behind the polished fables. And the most potent spells, they hid in plain sight. Snow White's evil queen obsessed over a mirror not because vanity was sinful, but because beauty was currency in a world where women's worth hinged on marriageability. The prince's rescue wasn't romance, it was economic salvation. Even the humble porridge pot in The Magic Porridge Pot carried a coded lesson. Obey the rules, don't overuse magic, or chaos engulfs your village. But here's where the story twists. The same tales that reinforced hierarchies also smuggled resistance. Baba Yaga, the Slavic witch who lived in a house on chicken legs, wasn't just a monster, she was a liminal figure, helping clever girls who outwitted her while devouring the foolish. Anansi the spider, transplanted from West Africa to the Caribbean through slavery, became a trickster hero, proving the weak could outmaneuver the strong with wit. The genius of fairy tales lies in their duality. They were society's scalpel-carving norms into children's minds, yet also its crowbar, prying open cracks in the system. Today's debates over woke retellings miss the point. These stories were never static, they were battlegrounds. Every time a storyteller swapped a helpless princess for a sword-wielding one, they weren't corrupting tradition, they were continuing it. Because the most powerful magic wasn't in the words themselves, but in who got to rewrite them. A nation isn't just borders and bloodlines, it's a story told so often people forget it's fiction. Take the Aeneid, Virgil's masterpiece commissioned by Emperor Augustus. On the surface, it's the tale of Aeneas fleeing Troy to found Rome. But read between the hexameter verses and you'll find something far more calculated. A propaganda piece stitching Augustus' reign to mythical destiny. By anchoring his rule to Aeneas' divine mission, Augustus didn't just celebrate Rome's past, he scripted its future, turning raw power into poetic inevitability. Half a world away, the Ramayana performed similar alchemy. When Prince Rama crossed a bridge of monkeys to rescue his wife Sita from a demon king, he wasn't just a hero, he became the archetype of Hindu kingship, his story recited for millennia to sanctify rulers as divine protectors. The epic's magic wasn't in its battles, but in its blueprint, a code of conduct so deeply etched into cultural memory that to question a king was to defy cosmic order itself. Yet for every epic cementing power, another lurked in the margins. While Spanish conquistadors enforced their Reconquista narrative of Christian triumph, Moorish poets in Andalusia preserved a counter-history in coded verses, love poems that doubled as elegies for a lost multicultural paradise. In Japan, the tale of the hike chronicled the fall of an aristocratic clan not as defeat, but as Buddhist lesson on impermanence, subtly critiquing the warlords who replaced them. The real power of these national myths lies in their elasticity. The same Mahabharata that justified caste hierarchy also gave us Krishna's subversive sermon in the Bhagavad Gita, urging a prince to question his duty. Beowulf's monster-slaying valor pleased Anglo-Saxon lords, but its melancholic tone whispered a darker truth. Even glory fades. Today's nations still dance to these ancient rhythms. Founding fathers become mythic figures, revolutions get polished into patriotic fables, and border disputes hinge on whose ancestral stories get labeled history versus legend. When Serbia clings to the Battle of Kosovo's 600-year-old memory or Texas romanticizes the Alamo, they're not just recalling events, they're weaponizing narrative. Because the most potent borders aren't drawn on maps, but in the stories we agree to call true. The terrifying beauty of national epics, they're never really about the past. They're tools forged to build unity or justify conquest, to maintain hierarchies or dismantle them. The pen might not be mightier than the sword, but give it enough centuries, and it will outlast every blade ever swung. When Alexander the Great marched his armies across Persia, he didn't just carry spears and shields, he brought poets. Every conquered city heard verses proclaiming him a god-king. His victories spun as destiny rather than brutality. This wasn't just vanity, it was psychological warfare, because the quickest way to turn occupation into allegiance isn't through force, it's through story. Fast forward to the trenches of World War I, where British leaflets fluttered over German lines, not with threats, but with promises of warm meals and mercy. The message was clear: your leaders lied to you. The most devastating blows weren't struck by bullets, but by rupturing the enemy's belief in their own narrative. Consider the iconography of war. Ancient Assyrians carved entire palace walls with scenes of enemies groveling at their feet, not just to impress visitors, but to rewrite history in stone. Nazi propaganda films like Triumph of the Will didn't document reality. They constructed it, turning rallies into religious spectacles and Hitler into a messiah. Even children's books became battlegrounds, like Soviet primers teaching toddlers to spot capitalist wolves lurking among peaceful lambs. The goal was never just persuasion, it was reprogramming. Make the enemy monstrous, the cause sacred, and dissent unthinkable. Yet for every propaganda machine, there's a resistance printing press humming in the basement. During World War II, the French underground circulated satirical cartoons depicting Hitler as a screeching marionette, his strings pulled by industrialists. Enslaved Africans in the American South turned spirituals into maps, singing about crossing Jordan while planning escape routes north. Even today, Ukrainian meme warriors troll Russian state media with viral videos of farmers towing tanks with tractors, turning despair into defiance, one shared joke at a time. The real power of propaganda lies in its fragility. However monolithic a regime's narrative seems, cracks always appear. When East German students began smuggling banned books past the Berlin Wall, they weren't just sharing literature. They were injecting alternative realities into a closed system. The Tiananmen Square protesters didn't just carry banners, they built a goddess of liberty statue from styrofoam, knowing symbols could outlive bullets. Because the darkest propaganda's secret isn't that it brainwashes, it's that it can always, inevitably, be rewritten. So the next time you scroll past a viral war meme or a politician's soaring speech, listen for the older echoes. The techniques haven't changed since pharaohs declared their enemies chaos serpents. Only the mediums have clay tablets replaced by algorithms, town criers by influencers. But the stakes remain the same, not just who controls the land, but who controls the story of what that land means. And in that endless war of narratives, every shared post, every retold joke, becomes something far more potent than a weapon. It's a seed waiting to grow into a new reality. History offers a grim paradox. The more fiercely a story is suppressed, the more tenaciously it survives. When China's first emperor Qin Shi Huang ordered the burning of Confucian texts in the 3rd century B.C.E., he wasn't just destroying scrolls, he was attempting to erase an entire philosophy. But scholars memorized forbidden verses, reciting them in secret until the ban lifted, proving that ideas inscribed in minds are harder to burn than those written on bamboo. Centuries later, Spanish conquistadors in the Americas torched Mayan codices, decimating indigenous knowledge, yet descendants preserved fragments through oral traditions and hidden glyphs, turning persecution into preservation. Censorship's greatest irony lies in its failures. The Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Catholic Church's list of banned books, inadvertently became a rebels' reading list. Dissidents sought out forbidden texts like Galileo's writings, their allure magnified by prohibition. Soviet Russia's samizdat networks turned typewriters into weapons, with carbon-copied manuscripts of Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago passing hand to hand like contraband. Even today, when authoritarian regimes block websites, citizens bypass firewalls with VPNs, transforming digital censorship into a game of whack-a-mole. But the battle isn't just about hiding stories, it's about hijacking them. In Nazi Germany, bonfires consumed degenerate literature while state-approved fairy tales painted Aryans as mythic heroes. Colonial powers rewrote African and Asian histories, labeling oral traditions as superstition while elevating their own narratives as objective truth. Yet resistance flickered in the margins. Kenyan women sang protest songs disguised as lullabies, and Native American communities wove resistance into beadwork patterns, their art a silent archive of stolen histories. The most potent censorship often wears velvet gloves. Modern algorithms quietly bury inconvenient narratives under avalanches of misinformation or algorithmic bias, a subtler form of control than book burnings. But the human impulse to resist remains unchanged. From bloggers in Myanmar documenting military atrocities on encrypted apps to TikTok teens skewering propaganda with satirical dances, the old dance continues. Suppression sparks ingenuity, and every erased story births a dozen new ways to tell it. Because ultimately, censorship misunderstands storytelling's nature. Stories aren't just words, they're living currents in the collective mind, shifting shape to slip through cracks in the dam. A banned novel becomes a folk song, a forbidden history resurfaces as graffiti. The louder authority shouts, "You can't say that," the more urgently the whispers answer, "Watch me." There's a special kind of alchemy that happens when ink meets oppression. The moment a story slips past palace gates and barracks walls, disguised as mere fiction. Consider the slave narratives of the 19th century, like Frederick Douglass's autobiography or Harriet Jacobs' Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. These weren't just memoirs, they were landmines in the literary battlefield. Planted in the hands of abolitionists, they detonated the myth of the happy slave, forcing readers to confront the raw humanity of those shackled by chains and lies. Douglass didn't just recount his escape, he weaponized syntax, turning each sentence into a mirror that reflected America's hypocrisy back at itself. But resistance literature doesn't always announce its rebellion. Sometimes it wears the mask of allegory. Take Orwell's Animal Farm, where a barnyard revolution becomes a scathing indictment of Stalinism. The Pig's Rise to Tyranny wasn't just a cautionary tale. It was a Trojan horse, smuggling critiques of totalitarianism into classrooms and libraries under the guise of children's fable. Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale works the same dark magic. By projecting misogyny into a dystopian future, she exposed how easily the present could backslide into theocracy. These stories aren't prophecies, they're vaccinations, injecting readers with just enough dread to recognize and resist the first symptoms of tyranny in their own world. The brilliance of subversive literature lies in its deniability. When Soviet dissidents circulated samizdat copies of Solzhenitsyn's One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, they weren't just sharing a novel about a Gulag prisoner. They were replicating an experience the state swore didn't exist, one carbon-copied page at a time. In apartheid South Africa, Nadine Gordimer's stories of interracial love violated racial laws so profoundly, her books were banned, but the ideas once released couldn't be unread. Even genres like science fiction and fantasy became battlegrounds. Octavia Butler's Parable series imagined a future where a marginalized woman founded a new religion based on change. China's Liu Cixin wrote The Three-Body Problem, a cosmic allegory where humanity's naivete mirrors political blind spots. These authors didn't just entertain, they engineered escape hatches from ideological prisons, proving that a spaceship or a wizard staff could be as revolutionary as a protest sign. And here's the secret censors never learn: banning a book only amplifies its power. When Khomeini issued a fatwa against Salman Rushdie's The Satanic Verses, he didn't silence the novel, he turned it into a global symbol of free expression. Every dictatorship that burns books forgets the same lesson: stories survive ash. They hide in oral traditions, encrypt themselves in nursery rhymes, resurface as graffiti or memes. Because the written word isn't just marks on paper, it's oxygen for movements, a way to whisper across generations. This happened, remember, fight back. Picture the flickering glow of a silver screen in the 1920s. The first time a human face 20 feet tall spoke to an audience, and suddenly, storytelling wasn't just heard or read. It was felt in the gut. Hollywood didn't invent myths, it industrialized them, turning ancient archetypes into blockbuster franchises. When George Lucas wove Joseph Campbell's hero's journey into Star Wars, he wasn't just making space opera, he was tapping into a neural blueprint older than Babylon, proving that Luke Skywalker and Gilgamesh drink from the same cosmic well. But here's the twist: cinema's real power isn't in escapism, it's in colonization. Westerns didn't just entertain, they scripted manifest destiny as destiny, turning genocide into heroic conquest. Rom-coms didn't just sell love, they sold heteronormativity as natural law. And when Marvel films dominate global box offices, they're not just exporting entertainment, they're standardizing what heroism looks like from Lagos to Lahore. The camera doesn't record reality, it designs it frame by carefully curated frame. Yet for every Titanic reinforcing class divides as romantic tragedy, there's a parasite exposing them as horror. While Disney sanitized fairy tales into corporate fables, auteurs like Guillermo del Toro resurrected Pan's Labyrinth's Franco-era resistance through fantasy. Even superhero tropes get hijacked. Black Panther's Wakanda wasn't just a Marvel set piece. It was Afrofuturism's rebuttal to colonial narratives, proving that whoever controls the origin story controls the future. Now shift the lens to your phone. Social media didn't democratize storytelling, it fractalized it. TikTok dances and Twitter threads are today's campfire tales, where a teenager live streaming a protest can rewrite a news cycle in real time. Algorithms don't just recommend content, They engineer collective memory, prioritizing some narratives while shadow banning others into oblivion. A viral lie spreads faster than a fact check, not because it's true, but because it's weaponized story, simpler, sharper, and soaked in dopamine. But the revolution whispers in the margins. Me Too turned personal trauma into global reckoning through shared testimony. K-pop stans drown out hate hashtags with fan edits, turning pop culture into digital activism. Even AI-generated deepfakes reveal storytelling's nuclear age, where reality itself can be synthesized, and the only antidote is critical literacy, the chilling truth. We're no longer just consuming stories. We're swimming in them, breathing them, metabolizing them faster than our brains can filter. The myths aren't carved in stone or printed on parchment anymore. They're pixels and algorithms, memes and metadata. And every time we click, share, or binge, we're not passive spectators. We're voting with our attention, our dollars, our silence, on which stories survive to shape the next century. So before you press play, ask yourself, who's scripting the world you think you see? And more importantly, what story will you disrupt? The Marlboro Man didn't ride across billboards to sell cigarettes. He sold freedom, rugged individualism, a fantasy of the untamed frontier where every drag was a rebellion against the grind of modern life. That's the dark alchemy of advertising. It doesn't peddle objects but identities. Nike's Just Do It isn't about sneakers. It's a mantra for overcoming adversity, a story where the listener is the hero and the product is their magical talisman. Apple's sleek devices aren't tools, they're keys to an exclusive club of creatives and visionaries, a narrative so potent that customers line up for hours to buy into the next chapter. Beneath every logo lies a mythology. Coca-Cola didn't become a global empire by selling sugar water. It sold Santa Claus. The jolly, red-suited figure we know today was largely shaped by Coke's 1930s ads, transforming a religious saint into the mascot of consumer joy. Fast food chains don't sell burgers. They sell family togetherness, or late-night adventure, or even patriotism. Think of those Heartland-themed commercials where every bite supposedly tastes like American values. These narratives are so effective that they bypass logic entirely, tapping directly into our emotional wiring. But here's where the plot twists. Just as brands weaponize stories, so do the rebels. Culture jammers like Adbusters hijack corporate imagery to expose the manipulation, like their parody of Calvin Klein's heroin chic ads, replacing models with slogans about consumer addiction. Banksy's satirical street art turns advertising's glossy lies inside out, like his mural of a child sewing Union Jack bunting, revealing the exploitation behind nationalistic branding. Even memes have become guerrilla warfare against commercial narratives. Think of the viral edits mocking Kendall Jenner's tone-deaf Pepsi protest ad, where the internet rewrote the script faster than PR teams could spin it. The most subversive truth: advertising's power isn't in deception, but in confession. When Dove's Real Beauty campaign celebrated diverse bodies, it accidentally highlighted the industry's decades of harmful standards, proving even critiques can be commodified. Yet every time a teenager remixes a corporate jingle into protest anthem, or an artist projects anti-consumerist messages onto skyscrapers, they're reclaiming storytelling's oldest function, not to control but to awaken. Because the stories we buy are never just about the products. They're about who we're told we are and who we decide to become. Urban legends are the campfire tales of the digital age, stories like Slender Man creeping through forums or the infamous Momo Challenge whispered in schoolyards. They slither into our collective consciousness not because they're true, but because they tap into something far deeper than logic, our primal wiring for threat detection. When a Facebook post warns about kidnappers using perfume samples to drug victims, or a TikTok trend claims birds aren't real and are government drones. These aren't just lies. They're modern-day folklore, proof that the same neural pathways that once made our ancestors flinch at rustling grass now make us share unverified headlines at lightning speed. Fear doesn't just spread, it mutates. Take the 80s era satanic panic, where tabloids and talk shows convinced millions that secret cults lurked in daycare centers. No evidence, no problem. The story was too potent, a perfect cocktail of parental vulnerability, moral outrage, and cinematic villainy. Centuries earlier, medieval Europeans whispered of Jewish communities poisoning wells, while McCarthy-era America saw communists hiding under every desk. The narrative template never changes: an invisible enemy, a vulnerable us, and a shadowy they. Yet for every viral lie, there's a counter-narrative fighting for oxygen. Skeptics like the hosts of the Skeptoid podcast don't just debunk myths, they dissect why we believe them, turning each episode into a masterclass in cognitive biases. Fact-checking websites are the modern equivalent of village elders scrutinizing a traveler's tall tale. Except now the travelers are algorithms pumping disinformation into our feeds. Even horror itself gets hijacked for truth, like the "This house has people in it" ARG, which used creepy viral videos to lure viewers into learning about mental health awareness. The irony: the most enduring urban legends often contain a kernel of ancestral wisdom. Don't accept candy from strangers echoes in warnings about online groomers. Vanishing hitchhiker tales mirror our anxiety about disappearing in an increasingly surveilled world. These stories persist not because they're factual, but because they're functional, teaching caution through narrative long before children understand statistics. So the next time you feel that chill down your spine reading a midnight Reddit thread, remember, you're not just reacting to a story, you're participating in humanity's oldest ritual, the dance between fear and reason, where every shared whisper can either spread panic or spark clarity. The battleground isn't just about what's true, it's about whose story feels true enough to change how we live. Science fiction has never been about crystal balls, it's about crowbars prying open the present to show us what lurks inside. When Orwell sketched the dystopia of 1984, he wasn't predicting telescreens, he was dissecting the propaganda machines of his own era, magnifying their horrors to warn against the path ahead. Yet the terrifying beauty of speculative fiction is its self-fulfilling power. The very technologies Orwell feared, mass surveillance, thought policing, were later built by engineers who'd grown up reading his nightmares as instruction manuals. Take the eerie case of Huxley's Brave New World. Written in the shadow of rising consumerism, its vision of a society pacified by pleasure and pills seemed grotesque in 1932. Yet fast forward to today, where algorithms feed us endless distractions while antidepressants numb collective despair, and suddenly Huxley's dystopia feels less like fiction and more like field notes. Sci-fi authors don't just imagine futures, they hand us mirrors, forcing society to confront its reflection before it's too late. But for every cautionary tale, there's a utopia whispering, another world is possible. Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower didn't just depict climate collapse and corporate feudalism, it seeded the idea of Earthseed, a belief system embracing change as the only constant. Decades later, activists quote her protagonist's mantra, "God is change," at climate rallies, proving that speculative fiction can arm movements with language and vision. Even Star Trek's post-scarcity Federation, once dismissed as idealistic fluff, now fuels real-world debates about universal basic income and replicator-style sustainable tech. Tech oligarchs understand this narrative power better than anyone. Elon Musk name drops the culture novels when designing SpaceX's egalitarian corporate structure. Silicon Valley's obsession with neurolinking and digital immortality traces straight back to cyberpunk tropes from Neuromancer. When Mark Zuckerberg rebranded Facebook as Meta, he wasn't just pivoting to VR, he was invoking Neil Stephenson's Snow Crash, a novel where corporations eclipsed nations. The irony, these billionaires cherry-pick sci-fi's shiny gadgets while ignoring its central warnings about unchecked power. Meanwhile, marginalized writers weaponize the genre to rewrite their place in the future. Nnedi Okorafor's Afrofuturist tales like Abinti center African heroines in interstellar sagas, dismantling white-dominated space operas. China's Liu Six in uses the three-body problem to explore how authoritarianism might fare against alien contact, a narrative so potent it's now required reading for Pentagon strategists. Even cli-fi climate fiction has shifted from niche to necessity, with novels like Kim Stanley Robinson's The Ministry for the Future, sparking policy discussions on geoengineering and eco-reparations. The battle for the future isn't fought with rockets or AI, it's fought with stories. Whoever controls the dominant narratives about tomorrow shapes what we build, fear, and permit today. That's why dystopias spread faster than utopias. Cynicism feels more realistic than hope. But when activists Project Octavia Butler quotes on city walls or hackers embed radical sci-fi manifestos in blockchain ledgers, they're doing more than resisting. They're reminding us that every future was once someone's impossible dream, and the next one could be ours. Conspiracy theories don't spread because they're true, they spread because they feel true. Think about the last time you heard someone insist the moon landing was faked or that secret elites control the world. These aren't just claims, they're stories, complete with heroes, villains, and high-stakes drama. A flat earther isn't arguing physics, they're casting themselves as the lone truth seeker in a world of deceived sheep, a narrative as old as Galileo facing the Inquisition. QAnon didn't gain traction through evidence, but by offering a sprawling, interactive saga where followers could play detective, piecing together clues like some apocalyptic scavenger hunt. What makes these tales so sticky? They exploit the same neural wiring that once helped our ancestors survive. When early humans heard rustling in the bushes, assuming predator instead of wind kept them alive. Today, that same bias toward pattern-seeking morphs into connecting random events, vaccines and autism, 5G towers and pandemics. The brain would rather believe a flawed story than sit with uncertainty. And in an age of fractured institutions and information overload, conspiracy theories don't just explain chaos, they weaponize it, turning confusion into a narrative where someone, somewhere, must be pulling the strings. Yet for every false tale, there's a counter-movement fighting fiction with forensic storytelling. Fact-checkers like Snopes don't just debunk myths, they dissect how they're constructed, revealing the emotional hooks that make lies so shareable. Podcasts like You're Wrong About revisit moral panics not just to correct the record, but to show how fear gets packaged into cultural folklore. Even social media platforms, for all their flaws, host communities that reverse engineer conspiracy rhetoric, exposing how a single photoshopped image can snowball into a global panic. The real battleground isn't facts versus lies, it's which story feels more human. Anti-vaxxers frame their crusade as parental love under siege. Climate deniers spin themselves as defenders of working-class jobs. To dismantle these narratives, truth-tellers must offer more than data. They need stories that resonate deeper. When doctors share personal accounts of children dying from preventable diseases, or climate scientists document their grief over vanishing glaciers, they're not just informing. They're rewriting the script, replacing suspicion with solidarity. Because in the end, every conspiracy theory is a distorted reflection of real fears of powerlessness, of change, of being left behind. The cure isn't just skepticism, but better stories, ones that acknowledge the fear without exploiting it, that replace shadowy cabals with tangible solutions. After all, the oldest story isn't "they're lying to you." It's "together we can face the unknown." And that's a narrative worth fighting for. Social media didn't just change how we share stories, it shattered the very idea that storytelling belonged to kings, priests, or media moguls. Now, a teenager with a smartphone can ignite a revolution before breakfast. Take the Arab Spring, where tweets became the drums of protest, or Black Lives Matter, where a single hashtag turned bystanders into global witnesses. These platforms didn't just amplify voices, they rewrote the rules of narrative power, proving that a viral thread could topple regimes faster than any army. But here's the paradox: the same tools that democratize storytelling also weaponize chaos. A TikTok conspiracy theory about election fraud spreads faster than any fact check. Deepfakes blur reality until even video evidence feels suspect. Algorithms don't care about truth, they feed on engagement, rewarding outrage and spectacle over nuance. The same app that elevates a marginalized activist can also drown their message in a flood of bots and bad faith takes. Yet within this chaos lies raw, unfiltered creativity. Memes aren't just jokes, they're modern-day Aesop's fables, distilling complex ideas into shareable symbols. A single image of Bernie Sanders mittened and cross-armed at the inauguration became shorthand for grassroots resilience. Twitter threads dissect corporate greed with the precision of investigative journalism, while Instagram carousels teach history through bold graphics and bite-sized revelations. The real power shift: storytelling is no longer a monologue. It's a collaboration where audiences remix, reinterpret, and rebel. A tweet sparks 1,000 replies, each adding layers to the narrative. A TikTok duet turns a protest chant into a global chorus. Even misinformation spread reveals something profound. We don't just consume stories anymore. We live inside them, breathing their logic, defending their truths until fiction and reality blur. So where does this leave us? In an age where every scroll is a choice between enlightenment and echo chamber, between bridge and barricade. The gatekeepers are gone, but the responsibility is ours. Because the stories we share today aren't just posts, they're the foundation stones of tomorrow's reality. And in this endless, electrifying bazaar of narratives, one question remains: what kind of world will we choose to story into existence? Algorithms don't dream, but they're already writing our nightmares. Picture this: a news article generated in seconds, a novel drafted by code, a presidential deepfake so convincing it sparks riots. This isn't science fiction. It's the reality of AI storytelling, where machines don't just assist creativity, they replace the creator. OpenAI's GPT-3 can mimic Shakespeare or churn out clickbait, while tools like DALL-E paint images from text prompts, conjuring visuals from pure language. But here's the unsettling question: when an AI writes the story, who's really holding the pen? The danger isn't just fake content, it's curated reality. Social media algorithms already shape what millions believe by prioritizing engagement over truth. Now imagine that power amplified by AI that can generate endless persuasive narratives on demand. Authoritarian regimes could flood the internet with synthetic, eyewitness accounts of events that never happened. Corporations might deploy AI influencers selling products with eerily personalized pitches. Even historical records could be rewritten: deepfake videos inserting modern politicians into past events, eroding the very concept of shared truth. Yet for every dystopian twist, there's a subversive countermove. Marginalized communities are weaponizing AI to reclaim their stolen narratives. Indigenous activists use machine learning to reconstruct lost languages from colonial archives. Palestinian artists generate AI poetry from fragmented oral histories. Black coders train algorithms on African folktales to counteract biased datasets steeped in Eurocentric tropes. These aren't just tools, they're acts of narrative justice, proving that AI can excavate buried voices as easily as it can silence them. The battleground now is the training data, the hidden DNA of every AI's imagination. Most large language models are fed on centuries of Western literature, reinforcing outdated power structures. But collectives like Eluther AI are building open-source alternatives trained on anarchist manifestos, queer theory, and indigenous knowledge. The result, a chatbot that cites Frantz Fanon instead of Forbes, or generates protest slogans in the style of Order Lord. This is storytelling as radical reprogramming, hacking the machines to dream in colors the mainstream never taught them. The irony is delicious. The same technology threatening to homogenize culture could become its greatest diversifier. Imagine AI griots preserving oral traditions, or algorithms translating silenced histories into viral AR experiences. Picture a future where community-owned models generate hyperlocal folktales for every neighborhood, countering the monoculture of Hollywood and Netflix. The stories we feed these machines today will shape the myths of tomorrow, not carved in stone but coded in silicon. So the next time you read a generated news summary or laugh at an AI meme, listen for the whispers behind the code. Every algorithm has ancestors, the humans who shaped its biases, the data that taught it what matters. The real story isn't whether machines can tell tales. It's whose stories they've been taught to value and who gets to rewrite the curriculum. Because if storytelling is the oldest technology of control, then AI is its ultimate amplifier, and the choice between echo and revolution is still ours to make. Every textbook is a silent coup, a carefully edited version of reality disguised as objective truth. Consider how American classrooms long taught Columbus as a heroic explorer while omitting the enslavement and epidemics he unleashed, or how British schools framed colonialism as benevolent civilization rather than violent extraction. These aren't innocent omissions, they're narrative choices that shape generations of perception, turning conquest into adventure and oppression into progress. The stories we feed children don't just educate, they engineer collective memory, determining who gets cast as the hero, the villain, or worse, erased entirely. Yet for every sanitized lesson plan, there's a teacher smuggling in counter-narratives. In Texas, where textbooks downplay slavery's role in the Civil War, educators secretly assign Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States. In Japan, despite government resistance, some instructors teach comfort women's testimonies alongside imperial triumphs. Even the humble sticky note becomes a rebel tool. Students in Hungary scribbling marginalized Roma histories over state-approved pages. The classroom isn't just where stories are consumed, it's where they're contested, one subversive footnote at a time. The stakes couldn't be higher. When Indigenous Australian children finally hear Dreamtime creation stories alongside British colonization timelines, it's not just curriculum reform, it's cognitive justice. Germany's mandatory Holocaust education doesn't just recount events. It forces students to confront how ordinary people became complicit, weaving moral caution into national identity. Meanwhile, Rwanda teaches genocide remembrance through Ubuntu philosophy, not as ancient history, but as a living lesson in collective humanity. These aren't neutral facts. They're narrative vaccines against future violence, but the battle isn't just over content, it's over voice, whose storytelling gets the stamp of authority. In South Africa, students toppled colonial statues while demanding decolonized syllabi. arguing that Eurocentric frameworks couldn't diagnose African realities. Oklahoma's bans on critical race theory reveal the same fear. Stories have consequences. When children learn redlining wasn't just bad luck, but systemic design, or that wage gaps trace to policy, not personal failure, they don't just memorize, they mobilize. The most radical classrooms operate like story laboratories. Brazilian teachers use Augusto Boal's theater of the oppressed to turn history into participatory drama. Students reenacting slave revolts not as distant events, but as blueprints for civic action. Finnish schools integrate Sami Joik singing into music lessons, preserving oral traditions the state once tried to erase. Even preschools wield narrative power. Montessori tools like peace tables teach conflict resolution through storytelling, proving empathy can be curriculum. What emerges isn't just education, but narrative architecture. Every lesson plants seeds. Some will wither, others grow into the frameworks future citizens use to interpret justice, belonging, and power. The real test isn't whether children can recite dates, but whose stories they'll trust when the textbook closes and the world asks them to choose sides. Because the tales we assign today don't just fill minds, they forge moral compasses. There's a quiet violence in the way a sacred story can be hollowed out, stripped of its roots, repackaged, and sold as exotic decor. Consider the Hopi tribe's Kachina dolls, spiritual messengers carved for centuries in Arizona's Red Rock deserts. When mass-produced replicas started appearing on boutique shelves and dorm room posters, it wasn't just commerce. It was a severing, a disconnect between the object and the generations of prayers, droughts, and survival it once represented. Cultural appropriation doesn't just borrow, it amputates, divorcing symbols from their soul and leaving the original storytellers voiceless in the shadow of their own heritage. Yet for every act of narrative theft, there's a reclamation rewriting the script. When Navajo choreographer Rulan Tanjan blends traditional powwow steps with contemporary dance, she's not performing for outsiders. She's decolonizing movement, asserting that indigenous artistry isn't a relic but a living, evolving force. The Maori language renaissance in New Zealand follows the same blueprint. After generations of children being punished for speaking Te Reo in schools, activists flooded TikTok with slang tutorials and viral Waiata songs, turning a suppressed tongue into a badge of cool. Reclamation isn't nostalgia, it's defiance with a heartbeat. The battleground often hides in plain sight. Jazz, born from black spirituals and blues, was whitewashed by bandleaders like Paul Whiteman in the 1920s, who dubbed himself the King of Jazz while marginalizing the black innovators who birthed the genre. But legends like Ella Fitzgerald and Miles Davis didn't just play music, they weaponized it, using improvisation to assert that black creativity couldn't be contained or copied. Even hip-hop's global dominance carries this tension. Corporate brands profit from its aesthetic while grassroots collectives like the Zulu Nation safeguard its radical origins. Language itself becomes contested territory. The word chai means tea in Hindi, yet Western cafes rebrand it as a milky, spiced luxury, erasing its everyday roots in South Asian households. But when writers like Ocean Vuong weave Vietnamese phrases into English poetry, they're not adding local flavor, they're refusing to let colonialism dictate whose words matter. Similarly, the Sami people of Scandinavia, long mocked for their yoik singing, now score Hollywood films with those same haunting melodies, forcing the world to hear their stories on their own terms. The line between homage and harm hinges on power. A white novelist retelling an Aboriginal Dreamtime story as fantasy fiction perpetuates extraction. But when authors like Alexis write Pen, the Swan Book, to reimagine indigenous futures through speculative fiction, it's resurrection. The difference isn't creativity, it's sovereignty. Who gets to decide if a story is shared, sold, or silenced? Whose interpretations are deemed authentic? This struggle isn't just about the past, it's about who designs the future. When Disney sanitizes Polynesian mythology in Mona, while actual Pacific Islanders fight for land rights, the stakes crystallize. Stories aren't just entertainment, they're the blueprints for survival, the maps that tell communities where they've been and who they might become. Every time a Dakota elder records an oral history or a Palestinian poet publishes despite censorship, they're not just preserving culture. They're planting flags in the imagination, declaring, "This narrative belongs to us." And in a world where ownership of the story often dictates ownership of the future, that's not just art. It's armor. Memes are the campfire tales of the digital wilderness, inside jokes that spiral into shared belief systems, absurdist humor that hardens into ideology. Take the rise of Pepe the Frog, a harmless cartoon character twisted into a hate symbol by online subcultures. What began as a goofy comic panel became a rallying flag for extremists, proving that even the silliest image can be weaponized when injected with the right narrative poison. Yet the reverse is equally true. When Hong Kong protesters dressed as Star Wars rebels or superimposed Winnie the Pooh over Xi Jinping's face, they weren't just mocking authority, they were exploiting the way memes bypass censorship, slipping dissent past algorithms trained to crush serious dissent. The magic and menace of memes lies in their alchemy. A single viral template, like Drake rejecting one idea and embracing another, can spread climate denial just as easily as it promotes voter registration. During the Arab Spring, protesters photoshopped riot police into Tomb Raider villains, turning state violence into a global punchline. Russian troll farms learned this lesson too, flooding Black Lives Matter hashtags with divisive memes to fracture movements from within. The pixels are secondary. It's the collective meaning-making that gives them teeth, a digital version of how ancient trickster myths exposed hypocrisy through laughter. But memes also harbor a secret resilience. When the Chinese government banned the Milk Tea Alliance, a pro-democracy meme uniting activists across Asia, teenagers simply rebranded it as Boba Solidarity, swapping one sugary drink for another. Ukrainian memes portraying Putin as a shirtless horseman didn't just mock the dictator, they stripped his carefully crafted strongman image down to absurdity. Even corporate attempts to co-opt meme culture backfire spectacularly, like when Netflix's forced Bird Box challenge became a cautionary tale about brands failing to grasp organic humor's anarchic spirit. What makes memes the ultimate dual-use technology is their deniability. A politician sharing a meme about protecting traditional values can plausibly deny its racist dog whistles, just as medieval jesters couched critiques in riddles. The difference: memes replicate at the speed of thought, mutating faster than fact-checkers can debunk them. Yet for every okay hand gesture hijacked by hate groups, there's a counter-meme, like indigenous TikTokers using viral dances to reclaim stolen land narratives. The battlefield isn't just about who controls the story, it's about who makes the story stick. And in the attention economy, absurdity often outlasts argument. This is folklore rewritten in real time, where collective meaning is negotiated through reaction GIFs and hashtag games. The most viral memes aren't just shared, they're lived, shaping how protesters organize, how voters perceive policies, even how Gen Z processes trauma through irony-drenched humor. When historians look back, they won't find our era's defining texts in archives or speeches, but in the million deleted tweets, the dankest inside jokes, the memes that made us laugh until they made us think, and sometimes act. Consider the simple phrase, "no taxation without representation." just 5 words scrawled on pamphlets in colonial Boston, yet potent enough to ignite a revolution. The American Revolution wasn't won with muskets alone. It was fought with printing presses, political cartoons of snakes chopped into segments labeled "Join or Die," and Thomas Paine's incendiary Common Sense, which sold over 100,000 copies in months. These weren't just arguments, they were narrative grenades, turning scattered grievances into a unified story of tyranny versus liberty. But revolutions don't just need stories, they need symbols sticky enough to survive bullets. During the Arab Spring, a Tunisian fruit vendor's self-immolation became more than a tragedy. It morphed into a global emblem of desperation under dictatorship. Graffiti of his burning body appeared on walls from Cairo to Madrid, while hashtags like #Jan25 turned personal rage into collective action. The Egyptian government shut down the internet, but the story had already escaped through whispered rumors, USB drives smuggled in bread baskets, and satellite TV broadcasts beamed from Qatar. Yet for every protest chant that becomes history, there's a regime spinning counter-narratives with equal ferocity. In Venezuela, state media framed student protesters as spoiled rich kids manipulated by the CIA. Russian troll farms weaponized memes to paint Ukrainian activists as neo-Nazis. Even the American civil rights movement faced outside agitator smears, with newspapers dismissing sit-ins as communist plots rather than moral crusades. The battle isn't just in the streets, it's in the framing, the myth-making, the visceral imagery that sticks in the public's mind long after the tear gas clears. Music has always been the stealth weapon of resistance. Slave spirituals like "Wade in the Water" doubled as coded escape instructions. Chilean folk singer Victor Jara's guitar was smashed by Pinochet's death squads, but his songs became anthems for the disappeared. Even Beyoncé's halftime show at Super Bowl 50, with Black Panther-inspired costumes, triggered Fox News rants about anti-police propaganda, proving that performance can still unsettle power structures. The real genius of revolutionary storytelling lies in its scalability. A single iconic photo like Tank Man in Tiananmen Square or the Afghan girl on a Time cover can say more than volumes of manifestos. Ukraine's Euromaidan protesters built a library of donated books amid burning barricades, transforming their rebellion into a metaphor for enlightenment versus authoritarian darkness. Meanwhile, Belarusian women marched in white dresses with flowers, weaponizing femininity against a regime that expected violent clashes. What emerges isn't just a history of upheaval, but a playbook still in use today. Black Lives Matters say their names. Ritual forces America to see police brutality victims as more than statistics. Hong Kong's Lennon walls, plastered with post-it notes of protest art, turned public spaces into collaborative storyboards. Even the most brutal crackdowns often backfire. When Syria's government bombed a children's hospital in Aleppo, the footage didn't spread despair. It fueled international recruitment for aid groups. Because revolutions don't triumph when they seize palaces. They win when their stories outmaneuver censorship, when a slogan chanted in a square becomes whispered in kitchens, when a meme mocking a dictator circulates so widely that fear turns to ridicule. The pen might not always be mightier than the sword, but the story that outlives both, that's the true revolution. The human brain doesn't process stories, it lives them. When you hear about a child shivering in a war-torn village, your neurons fire as if you're the one trembling in the cold. This isn't metaphor, it's neuroscience. Functional MRI scans show that compelling narratives activate the sensory cortex, making listeners taste the salt of a character's tears or flinch at phantom gunfire. Facts light up the analytical prefrontal cortex like a flickering bulb, but stories set the whole brain ablaze, weaving ideas into the fabric of memory itself. This neural hijacking explains why a well-told lie often outlives a poorly presented truth. Charismatic leaders from cult figures to political firebrands don't recite spreadsheets of data. They offer origin myths, villains to vanquish, and promised lands. Consider Jim Jones' People's Temple, where apocalyptic sermons about capitalist wolves and socialist salvation weren't just speeches. They were immersive sensory experiences, complete with fake poison drills and staged attacks, blurring the line between story and reality until followers willingly drank cyanide-laced punch. The same neural mechanisms that once helped tribes bond over campfire tales now make QAnon's labyrinthine conspiracy theories feel like sacred texts to adherents. Advertisers exploit this wiring with surgical precision. Nike's Dream Crazy campaign didn't list shoe specifications. It showed Colin Kaepernick's face over the words, "Believe in something, even if it means sacrificing everything." The ad triggered the brain's mirror neurons, letting viewers feel his defiance as their own, while the amygdala processed the controversy as a personal threat. By the time logic caught up, the slogan was already tattooed on the emotional brain, and sales spiked 31%. Yet activists wield the same tools for liberation. The LGBTQ+ movement didn't win marriage equality by citing legal precedents alone. It flooded airwaves with stories of elderly partners denied hospital visits, of soldiers whispering their love in letters from war zones. These narratives transformed abstract rights into visceral heartache, bypassing ideological resistance by appealing to universal human instincts for love and loss. Even climate scientists now frame data as stories, not just rising CO2 levels, but drowning polar bears and vanished glaciers, because the brain prioritizes emotional stakes over statistics. The most dangerous stories aren't the ones we dissect, but the ones we inhale unconsciously. A child raised on Disney princesses learns that love conquers all except poverty or racism, which never appear in the script. A teenager binge-watching Wolf of Wall Street might internalize greed as glamour before the prefrontal cortex matures enough to question it. These narratives seep into our mental groundwater, shaping desires and fears before we even notice the flavor. Resistance begins with metacognition, the act of noticing the stories we're swimming in. When a politician invokes traditional values, ask whose traditions and who benefits from their preservation. When an ad promises transformation through a product, spot the hero's journey template beneath the gloss. The goal isn't cynicism, but literacy, recognizing that every story is a spell, and the first step to breaking its hold is seeing the wand in the storyteller's hand. Because once you understand how narratives hack your hardware, you gain the rarest power of all, the ability to rewrite yourself. For centuries, the power to shape history belonged to those who controlled the printing presses, the pulpits, and the airwaves, but something seismic is shifting. Indigenous grandmothers record oral histories on smartphones. Formerly incarcerated poets turn prison memoirs into viral Twitter threads. Syrian refugees document bombings on shaky smartphone footage, while Western news crews are barred from entering. This isn't just storytelling, it's narrative justice in action, a dismantling of the single story that's defined marginalized communities through the lens of outsiders. Take the Maori podcast Te Reo Irarangi, where elders teach their language through ancestral legends, reclaiming a tongue once beaten out of children in colonial schools. Or the Own Voices movement in publishing, demanding that autistic characters be written by autistic authors, that Haitian immigrant stories come from Haitian pens. These aren't trends, they're corrections, undoing generations of distortion. When the Inuit film, Atanajuat, the Fast Runner, became Canada's first Inuit language feature, it didn't just entertain, it shattered the stereotype of Arctic peoples as frozen in time, letting them narrate their own modernity. Yet liberation often walks a razor's edge. A white travel blogger discovering a sacred tribal ritual risks turning spirituality into content. A well-meaning documentary about famine can reduce complex communities to trauma porn if the camera lingers too long on fly-covered children without their consent. Even allyship stumbles here, like when a celebrity's social justice post amplifies a hashtag but drowns out the original activists who started it. The line between platform and plunder blurs when marginalized voices must compete with outsiders who repackage their pain for clout. The ethical dilemma deepens when stories become currency. A Congolese miner's account of cobalt exploitation gains traction only when a viral influencer shares it, but does the algorithm reward his truth or her savior narrative? Slave narratives in the 1800s faced similar exploitation, with abolitionists often editing survivors' voices to fit palatable tropes of pious suffering. Today's equivalent might be trauma memoirs that publishers demand must be more harrowing to sell, or poverty tourism YouTube channels monetizing others' despair. True narrative sovereignty isn't just about access, it's about control. The Navajo Times, owned entirely by the Navajo Nation, reports on reservation issues without outsider filters. Disability justice activists use TikTok to explain ableism in their own words, bypassing medical documentaries that frame them as inspirational objects. In Brazil, favela residents film their own lives with drones, countering police narratives that paint their neighborhoods as war zones. Perhaps the most radical act isn't storytelling at all, it's silence on one's own terms. The Hopi tribe strictly guards certain ceremonies from recording, not as secrecy but as sacred boundaries. A survivor of violence might choose memoir while another heals through anonymity, both asserting equal agency over their narrative. Because the ultimate resistance isn't just speaking, it's deciding when, how, and if the microphone gets passed at all. From the flickering shadows of prehistoric caves to the glowing screens of our smartphones, storytelling has never lost its primal grip on the human psyche. It's the thread that stitches together the fabric of every society, sometimes as a needle weaving unity, other times as a blade cutting through old truths to make way for new ones. Think about it, the same neural pathways that once thrilled to tales of hunting mammoths now light up for viral TikToks, proving that our brains haven't evolved past storytelling. We've just upgraded the delivery system. Empires rise and fall on narratives. Rome's legions marched under the banner of civilization's destiny, while revolutionaries like Thomas Paine dismantled kingdoms with pamphlets that fit in a pocket. Today, algorithms decide which stories flood our feeds, amplifying some voices and silencing others with the precision of a censor's pen. The battleground hasn't changed, only the weapons. A meme can spark a protest, a hashtag can rewrite history, and a single live stream can expose injustices that newspapers ignored for decades. Yet here's the paradox: the more stories saturate our world, the harder it becomes to recognize their power. We scroll past news headlines like they're weather reports, forgetting that each one is a narrative shaping how we see everything from climate change to crime. Advertisers spin fairy tales about happiness in a shampoo bottle, while politicians repackage age-old myths of us versus them. The stories we absorb don't just entertain, they program us, whispering subconscious scripts about who deserves power, what success looks like, even what love should feel like. But awareness is the antidote. When you pause mid-scroll to ask who benefits from this story, or whose voice is missing here, that's the moment you reclaim agency. History's greatest liberators knew this. Frederick Douglass didn't just escape slavery. He wrote his way into the American conscience, turning his life into a story so potent it helped fracture the system that bound him. Malala Yousafzai didn't just survive a Taliban bullet. She weaponized her narrative to shatter stereotypes about Muslim girls. So the question isn't whether you'll tell stories. You already do. Every time you share a post, recount your day, or even choose silence. The real question is, what world are you building with your words? Will you repeat the old tales that keep us divided, or craft new ones that bend the arc toward justice? The next chapter isn't written by kings or algorithms. It's drafted in the quiet choices of everyday people like you, pressing words into the digital clay of our age. The campfire's still burning. What will you throw into the flames?